Hey there, and welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping into the rough, chaotic, and unforgettable world of Elizabethan theater. You might picture velvet curtains, candlelit stages, and Shakespeare's golden words echoing through crowded playhouses. But behind the magic, life for the actors was far less glamorous. In fact, it was often brutal. Imagine finishing a performance in front of hundreds of rowdy Londoners, only to roll out a cloak and sleep right there on the hard wooden stage you just performed on. Actors lived inside the very theaters where they worked among costumes that reeked of sweat and grease paint, and props scattered like debris from the day's show. When they weren't sleeping under leaky roofs or tucked behind painted scenery, many were trudging along muddy roads, moving from town to town, praying for a patron's coin or a warm fire. And if the performance went badly, sometimes the audience didn't just boo, they rioted. Entire acting companies could be chased into the streets, dodging stones and rotten fruit, fleeing from angry mobs that saw them as little better than criminals. Because to many Elizabethans, actors weren't respected artists. They were vagabonds, liars, and dangerous tricksters. Yet somehow, through all the hunger, the danger, the sleepless nights, and the endless risks, actors kept climbing onto those wooden stages. They risked everything for the chance to feel the roar of applause, to move a crowd with words, to bring plays to life in a world hungry for stories. So tonight, let's step into their world. Not the polished history of Shakespeare's brilliance, but the grit and struggle of the men who carried his words and risked everything to perform them. The Elizabethan playhouse was not only a stage for wonder, but also a crucible of contradictions, where the loftiest lines of Shakespeare or Marlowe soared in candlelight, while rats scurried through the galleries, and the reek of unwashed bodies mingled with the sweet scent of oranges sold by hawkers. To imagine stepping into such a place in late 16th century London is to abandon every modern assumption about comfort, safety, or even respectability. For the theater was a place as much despised as it was beloved, as much feared as it was admired. And yet, in that rough timber and plaster world, dreams were woven with words so potent they would outlast the centuries. The playhouse itself rose like an oddity on the edge of respectability. London's authorities, suspicious of large gatherings and ever wary of sedition or sin, had pushed most theaters beyond the city walls into the liberties, those districts where regulation was weak and tolerance for vice stronger. There, among bear-baiting pits, taverns, and brothels, the theaters stood like hives of energy. The Globe, the Rose, the Theater, and later the Fortune were not gilded palaces, but wooden arenas, half amphitheater, half barn, their thatched or tiled roofs sheltering galleries, while the open yard stood exposed to rain or shine. For a penny, a groundling could stand pressed shoulder to shoulder with strangers, ale in hand, their boots sunk in the mud or dust of the pit, staring upward at the stage that jutted out like a wooden tongue. The crowd was not genteel in the way later centuries imagined theater audiences. Apprentices fresh from the workshop brawled with each other. Pickpockets darted through the press of bodies. Vendors shouted out their wares. And at the fringes prostitutes prowled, mingling business with entertainment. The wealthier sat in galleries, more protected from the jostle, their view slightly better, though not immune to the smell of the mob below. At the highest tier, nobles might display themselves in elaborate costumes, more interested in being seen than in seeing. And yet all classes, from vagabonds to lords, shared that space together, caught in the spell of the players. Behind the stage curtain, however, was no world of enchantment, but one of sweat, fatigue, and makeshift living. Actors were not the glamorous figures of modern celebrity, but men and boys, often stigmatized, living precariously from one performance to the next. The law still remembered the long tradition of branding players as rogues and vagabonds, for without a noble patron, they were legally considered little better than beggars, liable to whipping or imprisonment. A company's license under the protection of a lord, or, in the greatest case, under the Queen's patronage, gave them legitimacy, but that shield was thin. Respectable citizens muttered about the immorality of players, ministers thundered sermons against them, and plague orders closed theaters again and again, driving the actors into poverty. The physical playhouse itself doubled as their refuge. Many players, too poor for steady lodging or too itinerant to maintain a home, slept in the galleries or beneath the stage. Imagine them after the day's performance, the laughter and applause fading, the crowd dispersing into the London dusk. The floor would be littered with nutshells, fruit rinds, and spilled ale. The smell of sweat hung in the rafters. And amid that detritus, the actors spread out cloaks or straw pallets, curling up beneath the same beams that had rung with verse hours before. Candle stubs guttered in the draughts, and the wooden timbers creaked as the city's noises hummed outside. To them, it was shelter enough, for tomorrow they must rise, rehearse, and perform again. It was not merely poverty that bound actors to the theater, but also danger beyond its doors. A player's reputation was rarely safe in the streets. Apprentices, often hostile and unruly, sometimes attacked them. Puritans hurled insults. And rival companies might send hecklers or worse. Crowds that adored them in 1 hour could turn savage the next, if a play touched nerves too raw, or if tempers, stoked by ale, spilled into violence. Actors sometimes fled by the back passages of theaters to escape mobs angered by a satire too sharp or a portrayal too pointed at some living figure. Authorities watched closely, too, for the line between drama and sedition was thin. A poorly chosen allegory might be read as a critique of the crown, and the wrath of rulers could be merciless. And yet, despite all, within the circle of that timber structure, magic unfolded daily. The stage was bare of scenery in the modern sense, yet with words and gesture alone, it could become a castle, a battlefield, or the stormy seas of tempest. The audience knew the game and played along, their imaginations filling in the blanks. A single prop, a cloak, or a crown could transform an actor before their eyes. Trumpets blared, drums thundered, and the stage swirled with life. When Shakespeare's lines rang out, audiences heard their own hopes, fears, and follies spoken back to them in rhythms that lodged in memory. For a few hours, they forgot the mud beneath their boots, the hunger gnawing their bellies, the harshness of life outside. Still, the glamour of those words could not disguise the hardships of the players themselves. Companies were tightly knit, bound by necessity as much as camaraderie. They rehearsed relentlessly, for a repertory could demand half a dozen different plays within a week, sometimes with little time for preparation. Young boys, their voices not yet broken, played the female roles, painted and dressed to impersonate queens and maidens, while older men trained them with both harshness and care. Costumes, often the cast-offs of nobles, were prized possessions, more valuable than most props. A single richly embroidered gown might be altered and reused for countless characters, its fine stitching masking the poverty of the company. Off-stage, hunger was a constant companion. Payment was uneven, dependent on audience numbers, patronage, and the vagaries of plague closures. When theaters shut, companies toured the provinces, trudging from town to town, performing in inns or courtyards, often for meager coin. The road was no safer than the city, with robbers lurking and hostile locals ready to jeer. Yet they carried on, driven by necessity and by the peculiar devotion to their craft that kept them enduring insult and hardship alike. What strikes the modern mind is how fragile the whole enterprise was, how close it always hovered to collapse. A single spark could set a thatched roof aflame, as happened at the Globe when a cannon shot during Henry VIII ignited the building, consuming it within an hour. Disease, too, stalked the theaters. Plague orders closed them for months at a time, cutting off income, scattering companies, and sometimes carrying off players themselves. At such moments, The glitter of the stage was revealed as a precarious illusion, one breath away from ruin. Yet perhaps it was precisely this fragility that gave Elizabethan theater its intensity. Every performance might be the last, every gathering a gamble. The actors knew they lived at the mercy of fickle crowds, harsh magistrates, and the ever-present specter of sickness or fire. And so they poured themselves into each line, striving to hold the audience, to coax laughter, tears, or awe from a crowd that could so easily turn restless or hostile. Their survival depended on it. The contradiction of the Elizabethan playhouse lies in its duality, a place where dreams were conjured amid squalor, where art flourished in conditions that today would seem intolerable, where actors lived half as outcasts and half as conduits of timeless beauty. They slept in the same spaces that resounded with poetry, fled the same crowds that had cheered them, endured poverty even as their words enriched the culture of a nation. Behind the painted boards and the thunder of drums was always the weary figure of the actor, wrapping himself in a cloak against the chill, whispering his lines to the rafters before dawn, hoping that tomorrow's crowd would be kind. To enter the Elizabethan playhouse, then, is to step into a paradox, at once a sanctuary of imagination and a den of vice, a place of soaring language and of crawling vermin, of applause that could turn to riot, of actors who might be honored one moment and haunted the next. It was a world where the boundaries between performance and survival blurred until they became inseparable. And out of that precarious, dangerous, exhilarating world arose some of the greatest drama ever written, words that have outlived the timber, the straw, and even the very actors who first gave them voice. And so when we look back upon that time, when we hear of Shakespeare's lines echoing through the globe, or Marlowe's heroes striding across the stage, we must also remember the unseen reality. The exhausted players bedding down on bare boards, the smell of sweat and ale, the fear of mobs or magistrates, the gnawing hunger in their bellies. The playhouse was no palace. It was a place of survival as much as of art. But in that raw, imperfect space, beauty was born, carried on the voices of men who lived closer to vagabonds than to kings, and yet who spoke with a grandeur that time itself could not silence. The curtain might rise in London, but long before many Elizabethan actors reached the city, their journey began on the open road. The life of a player was rarely fixed one stage. It was instead a wandering existence, a restless trudge from one town to the next, where fortunes shifted with every performance and survival depended on the kindness or scorn of strangers. If the theater was a place of magic, then the road was its harsh, unrelenting backbone. Picture a ragtag company of performers, their costumes bundled on their backs or packed in rough wooden trunks dragged on carts, instruments slung over shoulders, and scripts, if they were lucky enough to have them, stuffed into satchels already torn at the seams. Shoes wore through quickly, and the endless miles of muddy track between towns left more than a few actors limping. These players were not glamorous figures. To many villagers, they were drifters, no more respectable than beggars. Yet to others, they were bearers of wonder, messengers of stories that stretched beyond the parish church or the Lord's manor. The road tested every actor's endurance. Rain soaked their threadbare cloaks, wind carried dust into their eyes, and hunger was a constant companion. Inns, when they could afford them, offered cramped rooms, stale bread, and ale watered down by greedy innkeepers. More often than not, they slept under hedgerows, in barns, or on the floor of the sympathetic farmer's cottage. A night in a soft bed was rare enough to be remembered for months. The actors' bodies hardened under this relentless movement, and though they longed for stability, the road carved its shape into their very existence. At every destination, uncertainty awaited. Would the town welcome them, or would the magistrates turn them away? Actors lived under suspicion, their art often viewed as disruptive, even sinful. Some towns saw them as potential spreaders of disease, or as idle men who lured youth away from honest labor. Licenses were required to perform, but even with papers in hand, local authorities could decide to banish them. And when plague raged, which it often did, companies found themselves barred from town after town, wandering endlessly with nowhere to perform, nowhere to earn, and no food to eat. Yet there was another side to this wandering. The road gave actors their freedom. A company might perform in a lord's great hall one night, and in the courtyard of a bustling inn the next. Children would peer through cracks in fences. Old women would lean on their sticks, and laborers would crowd close, eager to see battles, lovers, and fools brought to life. For a brief moment, the actor was not a vagabond but a magician, transforming mud and timber into kingdoms, and lifting weary spirits into realms of imagination. Still, the road's hardships left scars. Accidents were common carts overturned, horses bolted, and men fell ill with fevers that spread rapidly in close quarters. Death was never far away. When a player died on the road, burial was often hurried, carried out in strange soil with little ceremony. A fellow actor might scratch a crude cross into the dirt before the company moved on, for the show could not wait. Tomorrow, another audience would gather, and the dead would be left behind, their names soon forgotten except in whispered memory. Patrons were the lifeline that kept companies alive. Without the backing of a noble household, many troupes would not survive a single season. A letter of protection, stamped with a seal, meant safer passage and the right to perform. Companies such as Leicester's Men or the Lord Chamberlain's Men carried these titles with pride, for they lent legitimacy. But smaller groups, without such sponsorship, faced danger at every turn. They were branded sturdy beggars, subject to arrest and whipping under the harsh vagrancy laws. Some companies dissolved under the weight of fines and persecution, their members scattered, forced to find other work or starve. Even when patronage was secure, the road was unforgiving. Actors earned little, and the money that came in from performances was quickly eaten up by the cost of travel, lodging, and costumes. Some resorted to pawning their belongings, or worse, stealing. Others turned to side hustles, playing instruments in taverns, selling ballads in the marketplace, or offering comic turns at fairs. Survival demanded versatility, and an actor was rarely just an actor. He was also a singer, a dancer, a juggler, a storyteller, a mimic, and sometimes even a fighter when coin disputes turned ugly. The landscape itself shaped the rhythm of their lives. England's roads were rough, rutted paths, often turning to rivers of mud after rain. Bridges were scarce, forcing companies to ford streams or hire ferrymen, whose prices rose steeply when they saw desperate travelers. Winter froze the ground, making travel slower, but sometimes easier than summer's endless muck. Spring and autumn brought floods that swallowed carts whole. Always, the actors pressed on, because stopping meant hunger. And hunger gnawed constantly. Food was bought in scraps cheese hard enough to break teeth, bread black with chaff, dried fish with the salt still burning the tongue. Meat was a luxury, rare and fleeting, usually consumed when a performance had gone well or a patron had been generous. More often, meals were meager, and stomachs ached through the night. Actors learned to live lean, their bodies wiry and toughened by necessity. The camaraderie of the road kept despair at bay. In the long hours between towns, songs were sung to lift spirits, tales told to pass the miles. Friendships deepened under hardship, rivalries sparked under strain, and romances bloomed in secret corners of barns and hedgerows. The company was a family of sorts, bound not by blood, but by the shared crucible of wandering. Arguments flared about money, about roles, about the endless exhaustion, but the need to survive together pulled them back into uneasy unity. Children sometimes traveled with these companies, apprentices who learned by watching, absorbing lines and playing small parts. For them, the road was both school and home. They carried props, fetched water, and absorbed the rhythms of performance. Some grew into great players. Others, unable to endure the strain, disappeared into obscurity. Their childhoods were not filled with toys or games, but with rehearsals under trees, laughter around campfires, and the constant pressure of survival. And then there were the audiences. Townspeople gathered in marketplaces, courtyards, and inns to watch these wandering actors. Sometimes they threw coin, sometimes they threw insults, and sometimes they threw stones. A drunken crowd could turn hostile quickly, and companies learned to read the mood, adapting their plays to keep tempers cool. In rougher towns, actors performed with one eye on the stage and the other on the crowd, wary of sudden violence. Yet when the performance worked, when laughter rippled through a crowd, or silence fell heavy in a moment of tragedy, the hardships of the road seemed worth it. The actors, weary and worn, stood in the glow of torchlight or the fading sun and felt, for a brief moment, that they had touched something greater than themselves. Still, when the last line was spoken, when the audience dispersed, and when the company trudged back to their beds of straw, the reality returned. Tomorrow they would be on the road again, carrying their lives on their backs, searching for another town, another audience, another chance. The road shaped Elizabethan actors as much as the stage did. It forged resilience, demanded resourcefulness, and stripped away illusions of grandeur. Behind the famous names Shakespeare, Burbage, Alleyn lay generations of anonymous players who carried stories on their shoulders from one end of England to the other. Their footprints were ground into the mud of forgotten lanes, their voices once echoing in the courtyards of towns now silent. The life of the road was not glamorous. It was hunger and cold, fear and exhaustion, suspicion and rejection. But it was also laughter shared around fires, applause echoing in courtyards, and the unbreakable thread of stories carried forward. These wandering actors were not just performers. They were survivors, bearers of imagination across a land often hostile to their art. And though their names may be lost, their journey remains etched into the history of theater. For without their trudging feet, their torn shoes, their nights in barns and fields, the theater we celebrate today might never have taken root. They were the lifeblood of performance, and the road, merciless as it was their stage as much as any playhouse. For many actors in Elizabethan England, the theater was not just a workplace. It was a roof over their heads, a shelter against the biting night air of London streets, a hiding place from thieves, debt collectors, and hunger. The glamour of performance ended with the strike of a hand drum, but necessity forced them to remain within the wooden O long after the crowd dispersed. By daylight they spoke poetry, by night they fought with rats for scraps of food. Between painted scenery and ragged curtains, among chests of costumes smelling of grease paint and sweat, the players tried to find sleep. They did not sleep on feather mattresses or warm pallets. Instead, they sought what comfort they could. A cloak folded double, a spare costume rolled into a pillow, the rough wood of the stage beneath their ribs. Sometimes the benches in the galleries offered space, narrow as coffins, where a weary body might stretch out. But the cold air blew in from the Thames, and the wind crept through the cracks of the timber frame. It was not unusual to see an actor shiver through the night, his breath rising pale in the moonlight that seeped through the shutters. They curled themselves small to conserve warmth, huddling near each other the way soldiers on campaign did. Camaraderie was born in such nights. Men who by day shouted lines across the stage now shared silence, hunger, and the uneasy intimacy of sleep in public spaces. The noises of the night were their lullaby. Mice scuttled beneath the boards, their claws scratching faintly like quills on parchment. A loose shutter banged when the wind came hard from the river. Somewhere a dog barked, and the sound echoed through the empty galleries. Now and again, footsteps could be heard outside the theater gate, the tread of a watchman, or worse, the plodding shuffle of thieves who knew that coins had changed hands inside earlier that day. The actors listened with half-open eyes, their hands on knives tucked under cloaks. Many had nothing worth stealing, but desperation often does not care about the worth of what it takes. Better to wake at a sound than risk a blade at one's throat. Some actors dreamed of applause, even in their sleep. They mumbled lines from the day's play, the rhythm of blank verse spilling out into the quiet. Others dreamed of feasts, of roast meat and heavy bread, of things denied them. A boy player, no more than 14, might stir and whisper names he once knew before the company had taken him from a distant village. And now, lying on board sticky with spilled ale, he pressed his face into a borrowed cloak and remembered his mother's lap. The theater was a family, but it was a harsh one. By morning, the illusion had to be reset. The first light of dawn fell through the gaps in the roof, and the actors stirred like beggars roused from a church porch. They shook the dust from their cloaks, splashed their faces with cold water carried in from the pump, and tried to scrape the weariness from their eyes. To the world outside, they would soon be transformed again, lords, fools, warriors, lovers. But behind the painted masks, the truth of their lives clung to them like the grime of the boards. Some had eaten nothing since the crust of bread shared the previous evening. Some carried coughs that echoed in their chests, the damp air settling into their lungs. And yet, when the trumpet sounded to announce the play, they stood tall, ready to speak as though they themselves were kings. The scenery around which they slept was itself precarious. Painted cloths, simple props, a few wooden structures that could be moved as needed. A forest might be no more than a cloth stretched high with daubed trees, its edges frayed, its colors faded. A palace could be suggested by a chair and a crest. Yet in the quiet of night, when the players lay curled against those very props, the scenery took on new meaning. The forest was not merely a backdrop, but a canopy to shelter them. The palace was not for princes, but for poor men seeking a corner of safety. Their world was illusion, but their survival was not. It was said that actors in those days lived halfway between reality and dream. The stage gave them a voice larger than themselves, but when the play ended, they were returned to a life of shadows. Sleeping in the theater meant blurring the line even further. They were never wholly off stage, never wholly themselves. An actor might fall asleep beneath a crown he would wear tomorrow, his hand resting against the hilt of wooden sword. Another might wrap himself in a queen's discarded gown for warmth, his cheek pressed to the embroidered hem. And when morning came, he gave it back, smoothed it out, and watched as another took it up to play majesty before the crowd. It is easy to imagine the romance of it, the young poet scribbling by candlelight among the benches, the devoted player keeping vigil beside the stage. But the reality was often harsher. There was vermin in the dark, hunger in their bellies, and no true privacy. Laughter was common, but so was despair. A man who coughed blood in the morning still had to play a gallant lover by afternoon. A boy too weary to remember his lines would be struck or mocked until he forced the words through his cracked lips. For them, sleep was not rest, but an intermission, a pause before the labor began anew. And yet, despite the hardship, the theater became home. For men without land, without steady trade, without family nearby, those wooden walls were the closest thing to belonging. They learned each groan of the beams, each draft of air, each pattern of sunlight across the stage. The very boards absorbed their lives, footsteps by day, breaths by night. To live and sleep in the theater was to bind oneself wholly to it, to let it consume every hour, every need. It became a world entire. When the audience cheered, they felt exalted. When the audience booed, they felt the sting as if it were a blow. And in the quiet hours after, lying on their backs and staring at the rafters, they carried both the glory and the shame into their sleep. Some whispered prayers to keep their souls safe in such a transient life. Others sang softly to themselves, lullabies remembered from childhood, drowned beneath the creak of wood and the rustle of rats. Always, There was the sense that tomorrow was uncertain, that the theater might fall, that the plague might close the doors, that a riot might tear apart the stage itself. But for tonight, at least there was shelter, and shelter was enough. To sleep among scenery was to live within illusion, but it was also to carve out survival where none else was offered. The actors of Elizabethan England endured it not for comfort, but for the chance to stand again by daylight, to speak words that lifted them, however briefly, above the grinding world. They slept in theaters because they had nowhere else, and they woke in theaters because the play must go on. Between benches, beneath costumes, with dreams mingling with dust, they bore the weight of both glitter and grime. And so the playhouses, grand in memory but rough in truth, became not only stages for art, but cradles of weary bodies, where men became kings by day and beggars by night, and where the fragile dream of theater itself was stitched together in the quiet hours of sleep. There were nights when the playhouse, so alive with the laughter of the crowd and the thunder of applause, transformed into something far darker, a tinderbox waiting for the smallest spark. The same audiences that roared with delight could just as easily roar with rage, and when they did, the thin line between actor and victim vanished. For all their talent, for all their wit, Elizabethan players were men of flesh and bone, and nothing reminded them more of that than the sound of a mob boiling over into fury. The stage itself was no fortress. Wooden boards did not shield the players, nor did velvet curtains hide them when things turned ugly. Imagine it an afternoon in the Globe or one of the other crowded amphitheaters of London. A new play has just ended, and the actors bow, their voices still trembling from the final lines. The audience, 5,000 or 6,000 strong, begins to shift. Some clap, some whistle, some cheer, but then a murmur rises. Perhaps the performance mocked a local noble too openly. Perhaps a careless line insulted a religion, a custom, or a man with influence. Perhaps simply the crowd was drunk enough to find offense in anything. The murmur grows into a shout, and suddenly the faces that moments ago shone with delight are twisted into anger. The actors knew the signs. They could feel the air tighten, the way one feels the first rumble of thunder before a storm breaks. The jeers that began in the upper gallery would roll down like an avalanche, until even the boys selling oranges and ale were swept into it. A single voice might cry out, "Frauds, cheats, blasphemers!" And suddenly it was not a playhouse but a trap, with hundreds of men and women packed shoulder to shoulder, fists raised, ready to leap forward. For actors, this was not just theater, it was survival. They had no guards, no protection beyond their wits and their speed. When riots began, the players knew they had to move quickly. Some fled through the tiring house, slipping out the back into narrow alleys, still wearing their wigs or painted faces. Others ducked beneath the stage itself, crawling through darkness until they could find a hole or a loose plank that opened onto the yard beyond. There are stories half remembered, whispered more than written, of actors chased into the Thames, splashing through the water, with their costumes dragging them down, while mobs hurled stones after them from the banks. Part of the danger lay in the very nature of the plays themselves. Elizabethan drama was raw, immediate, often political. When Shakespeare, Marlowe, or their lesser-known contemporaries put words in a king's mouth, they walked a razor's edge. To flatter the wrong lord, to mock the wrong faith, to expose too clearly the failings of the crown's policies, these could be dangerous. Audiences were not passive. They were passionate, quick to laugh, but quicker to rage. The playhouse was a mirror, and sometimes what it reflected was too close to home. But it was not only politics. Crowds could turn violent for reasons as simple as boredom, or drink, or sheer frustration at the cost of entry. In the pit, where groundlings stood packed together in mud and beer-soaked straw, tempers were short. A shove, a spilled drink, a careless insult shouted during the play, these could be enough to ignite chaos. And when fists began to fly, it was often the players who suffered most, caught between their role on stage and the angry sea of people surging toward them. There are records of plays ending in full riots, of theaters forced to shut their doors while damage was repaired. Actors themselves bore the scars, broken noses, split lips, ribs bruised by flying stones. Some companies traveled with men skilled not only in acting, but in fighting, quick with a blade or club when the need arose. But even they were no match for a full mob, and so the wiser course was always to run. Picture the scene: a troupe darting through London's crooked lanes, still in their costumes. A man dressed as a king stumbling over the cobbles, crown askew, while another in a jester's cap pulls him forward by the arm. Behind them, shouts echo, "Catch them! Down with them!" And the crash of pursuit grows closer. The smell of tar, fish, and refuse clings to the air. Every corner threatens another gang waiting to join the chase. The actors, breathless, scatter into the night, each praying that the darkness will hide them. And yet, for all the danger, there was a strange thrill in it. These were men used to playing out dramas of blood and betrayal, of kings brought low and lovers hunted. To flee an angry crowd was, in a twisted way, to live their roles in truth. They might laugh about it later, if they survived how they outran 50 men, how one escaped by leaping into a brewer's cart, how another hid beneath the skirts of a sympathetic fishwife. Each flight became another story to share, another chapter in the life of an actor. But beneath the laughter was fear. Some actors did not escape. Some were beaten, some left for dead in the street. The law, when it came, offered little protection, for actors were not gentlemen. They were vagabonds, licensed only so long as they entertained and caused no trouble. When riots broke out, it was easier for officials to blame the players than the crowd. Fines were levied, licenses revoked, theaters closed. For a troupe already living on the edge of poverty, such punishments could mean the end. And so the actors learned to tread carefully. They rehearsed not only their lines, but their exits, mapping out the fastest way from stage to street, from street to safety. They cultivated friends among tavern keepers, merchants, and brothel owners, knowing that in a pinch, these allies might offer a hiding place. They carried charms, whispered prayers to Saint Genesius, patron of actors, or to whichever saint they thought might hear them in the din of a mob. Some even performed with knives hidden in their belts, though steel was often less protection than swift feet. Still, the memory of those nights lingered. An actor might stand upon the boards, lantern light gleaming in his painted face, and feel in the pit of his stomach that same dread, that at any moment laughter might twist into fury. And yet he performed, because what choice did he have? Acting was his livelihood, his curse, his calling. The same crowds that chased him through the streets were also the crowds that fed him, clothed him, kept him alive. He needed them, even when they turned on him. The city itself bore the echoes of such chases. Dark alleys where an actor once hid became whispered landmarks. A doorway splintered by a mob's fists stood as a warning to those who came after. And in the taverns where actors gathered at night, they told and retold the tales, how the mob had surged, how they had fled, how, in the end, the play was worth it. It was a precarious life, balanced on the edge of danger. To act in Elizabethan London was to accept not only the applause of the crowd, but their wrath, to risk one's body for the sake of art. And yet, somehow, they endured. They fled, they hid. They returned the next day to the same stage, as if nothing had happened, because the play must go on, even when the mob waits outside. And so it was that actors in Elizabethan London lived not only by their words, but by their speed, their cunning, and their courage. They were performers, yes, but also fugitives, survivors, men who knew that a single night's fury could change their lives forever. To step onto the stage was to step into the fire, knowing that the same hands that clapped could just as easily clench into fists. And still, They stepped forward. The actress of Elizabethan England lived in a world that balanced precariously between legitimacy and disgrace. To the common crowd, they were entertainers, sometimes adored, sometimes despised. To the law, they were dangerously close to vagabonds, men without steady work, drifting in troops that looked suspiciously like gangs. A company of actors, unlicensed and wandering, could be arrested, whipped, or driven out of town. Yet in the same breath, the same men could step onto a stage and bring princes, witches, or fools to life, mesmerizing audiences in ways no sermon or royal proclamation ever could. It was this strange tension between art and suspicion that made noble patrons not just convenient allies, but absolute necessities. Without the shield of a great lord's favor, actors were outlaws in all but name. But under the banner of a patron's coat of arms, the same players became a legitimate company, worthy of respect, licensed by authority, and permitted to perform. The story of Elizabethan theater is therefore not only about the stage itself, but also about the invisible scaffolding of protection that noblemen provided. It is a story of survival, bought with allegiance, of actors tethered to the whims of power, and of the delicate bargain between artistry and authority. One can imagine a group of weary actors trudging into a market town without such protection. Their clothes are ragged from travel, their props packed into carts, their faces shadowed with hunger. A constable watches them with suspicion. To him, these are idle men, rootless, and therefore dangerous. Unless they can produce a license signed by some great lord, the punishment will be swift. But if they unfurl a scroll stamped with the name of the Earl of Leicester or the Lord Chamberlain, everything changes. Suddenly, the constable steps back, bows slightly, and lets them pass. Protection, in the Elizabethan world, was not abstract. It was survival written in ink and sealed with wax. The system of patronage shaped everything about theater companies in this era. It determined their names, their opportunities, their access to court, and their very ability to exist. Actors did not simply form a troupe and call themselves what they liked. Instead, they became servants of a patron. Shakespeare himself, before he was the towering figure we remember, performed under banners such as the Lord Chamberlain's men, and later, the King's men. The names remind us of the hierarchy. Actors were not free citizens in the modern sense, but retainers, their legitimacy flowing downward from the hands of the powerful. In return for protection, they offered their craft. A noble patron could summon his company to perform for him and his guests in a private hall, a performance that might celebrate his status or distract him from the tensions of politics. In public theaters, their fame reflected back on him, enhancing his reputation as a man of taste and influence. It was a bargain, each side gaining what the other could not provide. The actors gained survival, the noble gained prestige. The stakes, however, were higher than simple convenience. In Elizabethan England, suspicion of wandering men was not paranoia, but policy. The country was riddled with anxieties, religious division, threats of rebellion, and fears of disorder. Actors without a patron looked too much like vagabonds, and vagabonds were feared as sparks of unrest. The famous Vagabonds Act of 1572 classified players without noble protection as rogues, subject to branding or whipping. The message was clear: perform without protection, and you risked not only your career, but your body. For this reason, every great company sought a patron of stature. Some aligned themselves with powerful earls. The Earl of Leicester, one of Queen Elizabeth's favorites, lent his name to one of the most famous companies of the day. Others, like the Earl of Oxford or the Earl of Sussex, likewise took under their wing groups of players who would tour the country in their name. To be attached to a powerful patron was to be licensed, legalized, and elevated above suspicion. Without such ties, actors were simply trespassers wherever they went. But this protection was not stable. Just as noble fortunes rose and fell, So too did the security of their companies. An actor's livelihood could collapse overnight if a patron lost royal favor, fell from power, or even died. The precariousness of this arrangement haunted actors constantly. Imagine the unease of knowing that your company's right to exist hinged on the health of one man. A patron's downfall could mean the scattering of your troupe, your props left to gather dust, your future uncertain. This fragility lent Elizabethan theater its constant sense of contingency, of art performed on the edge of collapse. At court, however, patronage opened doors that otherwise would have remained locked. Through a patron's influence, actors could perform for the Queen herself, an honor that elevated both the players and their sponsor. Elizabeth loved spectacle, and companies who performed at court basked in her attention. Yet even here, the patron's shadow loomed. A company did not appear before the Queen simply by merit of talent. They came as representatives of their patron's household, their artistry a reflection of his glory. Every bow, every line spoken, reinforced the hierarchy that tethered them to noble authority. Shakespeare's own career offers a vivid illustration of this bond. For much of his life, he was part of the Lord Chamberlain's men, later renamed the King's Men when James I ascended the throne. Under James's direct patronage, the company gained extraordinary prestige. They were no longer merely players tolerated by the law. They were the king's own men, licensed by the highest authority in the realm. This protection not only granted them security, but also ensured their survival through turbulent political shifts. Without James's favor, the very plays we now revere might never have been preserved, for the company that performed them could have been dissolved like so many others. Yet actors also lived with the burden of dependence. Their allegiance to patrons could trap them in political struggles not of their making. Rival noblemen competed for influence, and their actors became entangled in these rivalries. A performance might flatter one faction while offending another. Patronage offered survival, but it also carried danger. To displease a patron was to risk not only insult but ruin. Outside the halls of power, in the rougher spaces of the public playhouses, patrons' names still carried weight. To announce that tonight the Lord Chamberlain's men would perform reassured audiences and authorities alike. It signaled that this was no rabble of impostors, but a sanctioned troupe with noble backing. And for actors sleeping behind the stage, scraping together their wages, and enduring the jeers of rowdy crowds, that noble name was a lifeline, protecting them from the law's whip. But it is important to remember that protection did not erase hardship. Even the greatest companies lived with constant uncertainty. Plague could close the theaters at any moment, leaving actors destitute. A shift in politics could unseat their patron. A riot in the pit could lead to bans on performances. Patronage shielded them from being labeled outlaws, but it did not protect them from poverty, illness, or violence. The glamour of noble favor was real, but behind the glitter of performance, survival remained fragile. Still, for the men who walked the boards of the globe, the rose or the curtain, patronage was the thread that stitched their precarious world together. Without it, there would be no stage, no audience, no Shakespeare as we know him. Their art lived and died on the goodwill of those with power, and though this dependence limited them, it also preserved them. Noble patrons transformed a gathering of wandering men into something greater, a theater company that could endure. When we look back now at the plays of the Elizabethan age, at the soaring speeches and unforgettable characters, it is easy to forget the fragile politics that made their survival possible. But in every performance lurked the unseen hand of patronage, steadying the company against the suspicion of vagabondage and shielding them from the law. Behind the applause of audiences, behind the footlights and the velvet costumes, there was always a noble's name, stamped on a license, guaranteeing that the actors before you were not outlaws, but servants of a patron whose power gave them life. In this way, the story of Elizabethan theater is inseparable from the story of its patrons. For every actor who bowed on stage, there was a nobleman standing invisibly behind him, a protector whose favor allowed the magic of performance to exist at all. And though the actors may have shone in the candlelight, it was the shadow of protection that kept them from being extinguished. The stage was a place of illusion, a wooden platform upon which men transformed themselves into kings, clowns, devils, and heroes. Yet for all its enchantment, it was also a place fraught with peril. The Elizabethan playhouse was not a carefully controlled modern theater with fire codes, safety rails, and stage managers. It was a crude wooden structure, vulnerable to flame, collapse, and human error. And when audiences flocked in, pressing shoulder to shoulder, their laughter and jeers echoing beneath the open sky, the actors carried not only the burden of performance, but the risk of genuine harm. Behind the painted backdrops and beneath the roar of applause, danger lurked, ready to turn illusion into disaster. Consider, first, the sword fight. Stage combat was among the most thrilling spectacles of an Elizabethan play. Audiences leaned forward, eyes wide, as blades clashed and sparks flew in the sunlight. To see steel flash was to feel danger brush close to one's own skin. But those swords were not props. More often than not, they were real weapons dulled, perhaps, but capable of injury all the same. Actors drilled for hours to make their fights convincing without drawing blood, but adrenaline ran high, and mistakes were inevitable. One slip of the foot on a damp board, one overextended thrust, one strike brought down with more force than intended, and the illusion became reality. A wrist cut open, a cheek slashed, a rib bruised where the sword struck true. These things happened often enough that actors bore scars long after the curtain fell. And there were worse stories, whispered like grim warnings. Tales of an actor collapsing mid-duel, his costume darkening with blood as his fellow player dropped to his knees in shock. Both performance and life ended in a single stroke. Such incidents were rare, but not so rare that the threat was forgotten. The hazards did not end with steel. When a play called for spectacle thunder, lightning, or the descent of gods, the stagehands resorted to ingenuity. For thunder, they rolled cannonballs across the wooden gallery or shook sheets of metal. For lightning, they sometimes used powder, sparks, or even small bursts of fire. To modern ears, the idea seems reckless, almost absurd. Yet the Elizabethan stage was built for wonder, and fire was part of that wonder. Candles burned in sconces, torches flickered at entrances, and lanterns glowed backstage. All this in a theater made almost entirely of wood, its floors soaked with spilled ale, its beams dry as tinder from summer sun. It was not a matter of if a flame would catch, but when. The risk became grimly real on a June afternoon in 1613, when Shakespeare's own Globe Theatre caught fire during a performance of Henry VIII. A cannon fired for dramatic flourish sent sparks into the thatched roof, and within minutes, the building was a raging inferno. Audience members fled in panic, actors scrambling from the stage as flames devoured the timber above them. Though no lives were lost, the theater was reduced to ashes in less than 2 hours, leaving behind the acrid stench of smoke and the eerie silence of ruin. The Globe was rebuilt, stronger this time, with a tiled roof. But the memory of fire haunted the boards long after the flames had gone out. Even without catastrophe, the stage itself was a treacherous place. Scenery was crude but ambitious, designed to transform bare planks into palaces, battlefields, or enchanted forests. Wooden backdrops leaned on supports, often poorly balanced, liable to topple if nudged too roughly in the heat of performance. Trapdoors yawned open, waiting for actors to emerge from the underworld or vanish into it. A mistimed entrance, a stumble in the dark, and a man could tumble headlong into the pit below, bruised or broken before the audience even realized it was not part of the act. Stories tell of actors limping for weeks after such falls, their injuries hidden beneath layers of costume as they carried on, for to miss a show was to lose both pay and place. And then there were the pyrotechnics, crude experiments in controlled flame and smoke. Sulfur, pitch, and gunpowder were used to mimic hellfire, to conjure devils and demons with acrid clouds. The smell alone was enough to make eyes water and throats burn. But worse was the sudden flare when powder misfired. Actors playing devils often wore costumes of wool, fur, or pitch-blackened rags, and a single spark could turn them into living torches. Accounts survive of men singed, their beards scorched, their costumes smoldering, as they tore them off in front of a gasping audience. Some injuries scarred for life. Others left behind nothing more than a story told in taverns, but each reminded the company that the stage was no safe haven. Even beyond the physical hazards, there was the weight of exhaustion, which made every danger sharper. Actors performed day after day, often multiple plays within a week, rehearsing by candlelight and memorizing endless lines until their minds blurred. Fatigue dulled reflexes. A sword fight that had once been crisp became clumsy when an actor's arms trembled from weariness. A step across a narrow platform became a stumble when legs ached from too many hours on stage. The body grew careless when the spirit was stretched thin, and in that carelessness, danger found its moment. For the audience, all of this was part of the thrill. They wanted reality close enough to taste. When a sword nicked flesh and drew real blood, gasps rippled through the pit, half horror and half delight. When smoke filled the air, choking and acrid, they coughed and laughed, as though hell itself had risen to greet them. They came for danger as much as for poetry, and the actors obliged at terrible cost. Behind the curtain, once the applause had faded, wounds were bound, burns cooled with wet cloth, bruises pressed tenderly by fellow players. And still, the next afternoon, the actors returned to the boards, stepping once more into a world where illusion was always one misstep away from catastrophe. The life of the Elizabethan stage was never safe, but it was never meant to be. The actors knew the risks as surely as they knew their lines, and they accepted them for the sake of art, for the joy of living many lives within one, and perhaps, too, for the fleeting taste of immortality earned on a stage that might, at any moment, collapse into smoke, fire, or blood. The hazards of performance were woven into the fabric of the theater, inseparable from the magic itself. To act in those days was to dance daily with danger, to step out upon wooden boards that might just as easily kill as crown you in glory. And in that precarious balance, between wonder and ruin, lay the strange, perilous beauty of the Elizabethan stage. In the flickering light of the Elizabethan stage, there was something strangely haunting about the presence of women who are not women at all. To modern eyes, it can seem almost absurd that Juliet, Cleopatra, Lady Macbeth, or Desdemona were once embodied not by women but by boys, their voices still caught in that uncertain territory between child and man, their bodies carefully costumed to disguise the truth. Yet for the Elizabethan theater, this was no oddity. It was the rule. Women were forbidden from the stage, their absence written into the very structure of performance, so that the illusion of femininity had to be conjured from painted cheeks, falsetto tones, and the awkward grace of youth standing in for womanhood. Imagine the Globe on a crowded afternoon, the stage awash with noise, players rushing about in gowns and doublets, the crowd restless and eager. Into this chaos steps a boy of 12 or 13, his slight frame wrapped in silken skirts borrowed from the wardrobes of the wealthy, his cheeks rouged with crushed berries, his lips stained red to catch the eyes of those in the pit. He has been trained, coached, perhaps even berated into holding his shoulders just so, lowering his gaze to feign modesty, and tilting his voice upward into a higher, almost trembling register. In that moment, he is not a boy. He is Juliet waiting for her Romeo, or Portia plotting her clever disguise, or Ophelia descending into grief. The transformation depended less on the authenticity of the actor's body, and more on the willingness of the audience to believe. to suspend their knowledge of the world outside the playhouse and step into another reality. Yet this illusion was fragile. Audiences could be cruel. They knew very well that the women before them were boys in disguise, and this knowledge carried both humor and unease. Sometimes the humor was intentional, as when a boy playing a woman was scripted to dress as a man within the play itself, creating a dizzying layer of gendered disguise. Shakespeare himself exploited this trick repeatedly, delighting in the playful confusion of boys pretending to be women, pretending to be men. But there were other moments when the mask slipped, when the voice cracked, when a gesture seemed too clumsy, and the audience would laugh not with the play, but at the boy himself. This was the danger of the role. One wrong move could shatter the spell entirely. For the boys, the work was both opportunity and hardship. Many of them were apprentices bound to an acting company, trained not only in swordplay and stagecraft, but also in the delicate art of imitation. They had to learn how to walk with the sway of skirts, how to move their hands with an elegance that did not belong to them, how to soften their speech without sounding absurd. Some would have been naturally gifted at this, taking to the role with a talent that made them stand out. Others would have struggled, forced into a part that felt ill-suited, their discomfort masked only by sheer discipline. For all, it was a temporary career. As their voices deepened and their shoulders broadened, they would be pushed out of these roles, their usefulness as women evaporating almost overnight. The ban on women on the stage was born of both morality and control. Respectable women were not to be seen performing in public, their bodies and voices displayed for the pleasure of strangers. The theater itself was already suspect in the eyes of the authorities, often denounced from pulpits as a den of sin, a breeding ground for idleness and lust. To allow women to act would have been, to Elizabethan sensibilities, to invite scandal. Better to keep them at home, while boys already apprentices, already considered the property of their masters, could be molded to fill the gap. But while women were excluded from the stage, they were not absent from its influence. Many in the audience would have known full well that what they were watching was a kind of trick, and this gave the performances a strange energy. Some viewers no doubt found it comical, mocking the falseness of it all. Others may have been unsettled, confronted with the sight of femininity performed rather than lived. There is reason to believe that some even found it enticing. The blurred boundaries between boyhood and womanhood carrying a charge that polite society preferred not to name. In this way, the ban created not only a practical solution for the companies, but also a tension, a constant awareness that the women on stage were not real, and yet they were treated as if they were. It is worth remembering, too, that the boys themselves lived in precarious conditions. Apprenticeship was a form of servitude, binding them to a company for years in exchange for training and the promise of eventual promotion. Their masters could be harsh, demanding endless rehearsal, punishing mistakes, and expecting obedience. The boys were not just actors, but servants, fetching props, carrying costumes, and running errands when the stage was dark. At night, they might sleep in cramped quarters near the theater, or in the houses of their masters, where discipline was strict and privacy scarce. The glamour of playing a heroine before hundreds of spectators was balanced by the drudgery and vulnerability of life off stage. And yet, for all the hardships, these boys carried enormous responsibility. The success of many plays depended on their ability to convince. Imagine Romeo and Juliet without a convincing Juliet, or Hamlet without an Ophelia whose madness could move the audience to pity. The playwrights, Shakespeare most of all, wrote their women with a richness that demanded skill. A faltering performance could sink a play. A brilliant one could elevate it into something unforgettable. The boys were the hinge on which the illusion of womanhood swung, and the entire theater leaned on their shoulders. Public reaction was mixed. Some audiences adored the performances, praising the skill of boys who could weep convincingly or who seemed to glow with borrowed grace. Others condemned the practice outright, seeing in it a kind of moral corruption, a distortion of nature. Pamphleteers railed against the sight of men dressed in women's clothing, calling it sinful and dangerous. Sermons thundered against the theaters, warning that such disguises blurred the God-given order of gender and tempted men into wicked thoughts. For every cheer in the pit, there was a preacher outside declaring that the playhouse was a gateway to damnation. Still, the practice endured. Theatrical companies needed their Juliets and Rosalinds, and until the law changed, boys would supply them. Some grew into notable actors, remembered for their skill even after they aged out of the roles. Others vanished into obscurity, their names lost to time, their fleeting moment on stage preserved only in the lines of plays written for them. Behind the painted faces and flowing gowns were real children, working in a harsh and unforgiving world, carrying the weight of roles far larger than themselves. The absence of women on stage shaped the very nature of Elizabethan drama. Playwrights knew the limits of their actors and wrote accordingly. Love scenes were stylized, often avoiding physical intimacy, relying instead on language to convey passion. Moments of tenderness had to be painted with words rather than touch, because the sight of two boys embracing too closely might provoke laughter or worse, suspicion. In this way, the restriction fueled a kind of creativity, forcing writers to craft dialogue that could suggest the depth of emotion without relying on physicality. And then beyond the stage, there were the women watching. Housewives, widows, noble ladies in their galleries. They saw versions of themselves performed by boys. What did they think? Did they laugh at the awkward mimicry, or did they feel seen in some strange, distorted mirror? Perhaps both. The theater was, after all, a place of contradiction. Entertainment built on illusion, truth spoken by those pretending, power wielded by those at the bottom of society. In that tangled web, the absence of real women became both glaring and strangely invisible, accepted as the way of things even as it shaped every moment of performance. The legacy of this practice is not just historical curiosity. It reminds us of the strange contortions a society will endure to uphold its own rules, even at the cost of absurdity. In refusing women the stage, Elizabethan England forced boys into gowns, demanded that illusions stand in for reality, and asked audiences to play along. And play along they did, weeping for Juliet, laughing with Beatrice, fearing Lady Macbeth, never forgetting, and yet somehow always forgetting that the women before them were boys pretending. In the candlelit hush of rehearsal, a boy might whisper his lines, feeling the weight of words written centuries before he would be remembered. In the roar of the audience, he might tremble, knowing that he held the gaze of hundreds. Behind the stage, he might peel away his wig, wipe the paint from his cheeks, and return to himself, just a child again, caught between two worlds, forbidden from being fully either. It was a peculiar kind of magic, one born of restriction and necessity, but it was magic all the same. The Elizabethan stage shimmered with it, and in that shimmer, the women who were never there became, for a moment, impossibly real. Money was the great illusion behind the Elizabethan stage. To an audience packed shoulder to shoulder in the smoky light of the theater, the players might appear as grand as kings, draped in velvets borrowed from noble wardrobes, declaiming lines that shook the rafters. They could conjure a world of glittering courts, of kingdoms rising and falling. But when the applause died and the costumes were folded away, the truth was far humbler. Most actors earned less than the artisans who hammered the nails of the very stage they performed on. The wealth that poured into the playhouses rarely trickled down to the men who stood under the tiring heat of the afternoon sun, speaking lines that would echo across history. For the common player, payment was a thing of scraps. Wages were inconsistent, dependent not on a fixed salary, but on the unpredictable share of a company's earnings. Each performance might bring in a few shillings if the audience was large, or next to nothing if rain kept Londoners indoors. Actors were part of a communal pot, their fates tied to the fickle moods of a crowd. A week of packed houses might allow them meat with their bread. A week of empty benches meant hunger gnawing at their bellies. To understand the harshness of their pay, one must remember the price of a theater ticket. A penny was all it cost to stand among the groundlings in the pit. A penny cheap enough that apprentices, laborers, even beggars could sometimes afford it. For a few more coins, wealthier patrons could sit on the benches or even within the galleries. But however large the take at the gate, only a fraction of that money ever made its way into the actors' purses. Much was consumed by the theater owners, the costs of props and costumes, the bribes required to keep the authorities at bay, and the endless expenses of keeping a company fed and clothed. Those pennies stretched poorly. Imagine an actor walking home after a performance, his body aching from the exertion of shouting lines for hours in a stifling hall. In his hand, he might hold his earnings, just enough for a loaf of coarse bread, perhaps a wedge of cheese if he was lucky. Meat was a luxury saved for festival days. Often his supper would be as modest as any laborer's, despite the illusion of grandeur his voice had projected only hours before. Some companies offered their players a small stipend, a steady drip of coins to guarantee survival. But even then, the amounts were paltry, barely sufficient to pay for lodging in a shared room above a noisy tavern. Many actors slept 2 or 3 to a bed, their earnings too thin to allow for privacy. The coins rattled in their purses were often gone within days, exchanged for food, drink, or the rent demanded by innkeepers, quick to remind them that the glamour of the stage held no weight when the bill came due. And yet, for all its meagerness, acting paid slightly better than begging and carried more honor than thievery, though only just. Authorities frequently lumped players in with rogues and vagabonds, and in truth, their wages sometimes forced them toward desperation. When performances were banned during outbreaks of plague, companies starved. Some sold their costumes, pawning velvet gowns that had once turned them into queens. Others took to wandering the countryside, performing in barns and marketplaces, hoping to earn enough in a day to keep from going hungry at night. Consider the bitter irony. A boy playing Juliet might step onto the stage in a gown worth more than he would ever earn in a year. Those costumes were the treasures of the company, guarded and mended like relics, sometimes gifted by noble patrons who wished their silks to shimmer beneath the limelight one last time. The actor might wear the borrowed wealth of an earl's household, while his own shoes split at the seams, his toes pressing against worn leather. His stomach might be hollow, while he mouthed speeches of feasts and banquets. The luxury was all illusion, bought on credit and sustained by artifice. There were, of course, exceptions. The sharers of a company, the men who held ownership, saw far greater returns. A figure like Richard Burbage, co-owner of the Globe and the theater, could make a comfortable living, earning not just from his own performances, but from every penny spent by the audience. For him, acting was a path to wealth and even fame. But for the rank and file, the hired men who filled the background roles, life was another story. They were expendable, easily replaced, their pay rarely enough to lift them above poverty. The young apprentices, who took on the roles of women, were often paid the least. They were bound to their masters by contracts, their labor repaid with training, food, and perhaps a pittance of spending money. These boys might spend hours rehearsing speeches, learning gestures, and enduring the ridicule of the crowd, only to see little more than crumbs in return. Their masters collected the profit, while the boys themselves lived in the shadows of promise, hoping one day to step into the company as full players. Some actors found ways to stretch their thin wages. A clever player might charm a tavern keeper into offering cheap board in exchange for entertaining guests. Another might supplement his earnings by teaching fencing, singing at weddings, or scribbling verses for patrons. But these were precarious additions, dependent on chance and generosity. More often than not, the purse remained light, the debt heavy. It is easy now to imagine Shakespeare's company basking in glory, their plays performed for monarchs, their names etched into history. But in their own time, the men who carried those words across the stage lived precariously. One week might bring a commission from court, the next might leave them unpaid and wandering. The crown jewels of English literature were spoken by men who often could not pay for new boots. And yet, for all its hardships, the life of an actor offered something wages alone could not measure. The poor pay was endured because the stage gave them what no other trade could, the chance to step outside the boundaries of class. For a few hours, an actor could be a king, a warrior, a lover, or a god. The world bent around the sound of his voice. Though his belly rumbled with hunger, though his purse lay thin, he tasted a kind of immortality denied to the cobbler or the smith. The audience might never know the disparity. They saw the shining costumes, the soaring speeches, the gestures bold enough to reach the furthest gallery. They clapped for the illusion, not the reality. They left believing the players were touched by grandeur, when in truth, those same men trudged home through muddy streets to rented beds and empty larders. The theater itself was an act of survival, built upon meager coins and fragile hope. Sometimes, after a performance, an actor might linger in the echo of applause, reluctant to leave the glow of admiration for the cold night outside. He knew that once the costumes were hung and the stage went dark, he would return to being what he had always been, a man of little means, another soul scrambling for survival in a city that cared more for merchants and craftsmen than for voices raised in verse. His pay was never enough, yet he endured, because the reward of art was not counted only in coins. The actor's pay was a contradiction, both paltry and priceless. Measured in money, it was nearly nothing. Measured in legacy, it was everything. Their poverty funded our posterity. Their hunger bought the richness of English drama. The words they spoke, for a penny a head, have echoed across centuries, long after the thin wages were forgotten. So when we imagine those players, striding upon rough wooden boards, their faces lit by flickering tallow, we must also picture the coins in their pockets light, few and fleeting. They carried within them the burden of scarcity, yet they gave us the illusion of abundance. The theater fed London with dreams, but it seldom fed the actors who made them real. And in that gap between illusion and reality lies the true cost of the Elizabethan stage. A world of glory, purchased at the price of poverty, lines of immortal poetry, spoken by men who counted every coin, and an art sustained not by wealth, but by sacrifice. Public prejudice was the ever-present shadow that clung to Elizabethan actors, darker than any candle-lit corner of the theater. Outside the boards, beyond the smell of sweat, tallow, and rosin, the world of ordinary townsfolk viewed them with suspicion, sometimes with contempt. It was not the glitter of costumes or the brilliance of recited verse that defined their reputation among the common people, but the fact that they belonged to a class apart, a class that defied normalcy, shuffled the rules of social order, and lived by a code that seemed, to outsiders, reckless and dangerous. Actors were considered vagabonds by the law, though not entirely criminals. They wandered, performed for coin, and depended on patrons for survival. To the ordinary citizen, a man or boy who could slip into a woman's role, command emotion with nothing but a gesture and a voice, and disappear again into the streets, seemed unnatural. To many, such talents could only belong to someone morally suspect. Mothers warned their children not to trust these performers. Fathers cast wary eyes on young men who spent days on the boards instead of learning a proper trade. The very act of performing, of imitating life, was seen as bordering on deceit. And in a world where superstition ran as freely as the Thames, deceit could very quickly be linked to dark, supernatural forces. It was whispered that actors consorted with devils, that their ability to convince audiences of love, rage, or grief was unnatural, a corruption of truth. Some claimed that the quicksilver eyes of performers, trained to read and manipulate crowds, were capable of hypnotizing or cursing. Stories circulated in alehouses and marketplaces of men falling sick after mocking or insulting a player, of crops failing after a troupe had passed through a village. Such tales, however fanciful, cemented the idea that actors were dangerous, untouchable, and morally suspect. Actors also carried the stigma of immorality. Life in the theater, with its crowded inns, borrowed fineries, and nightly performances, appeared decadent. Outsiders knew little of the long hours of rehearsal, the physical toll, and the constant hunger that many endured, and even less of the discipline required to memorize dozens of lines and movements for multiple plays a week. What they did see was a group of men and boys often in close quarters, living outside the conventional structures of family, sometimes associating with rogues and criminals, traveling from town to town. To the wary townsfolk, this was sufficient evidence of moral laxity. The law reinforced these prejudices. Actors were classified under the vagabond laws, often forced to prove their affiliation with a legitimate company before performing. Those caught performing without papers or licenses could be whipped, fined, or driven from town. Their itinerant lifestyle, though born of necessity, was treated as a threat to order. Ordinary citizens learned to associate the sight of a troupe arriving with disruption. A sudden gathering of crowds, noise in the streets, the risk of theft or disorder, the fear of the unknown, of individuals who could step into any role and disappear at will, fed the cycle of prejudice. Gender roles intensified the suspicion. Boys playing female roles were particularly targeted by rumor and disdain. Outsiders could not understand the artifice. To them, a young man dressed as a woman, speaking in gentle tones and moving with careful grace, violated the natural order. Accusations of effeminacy or unnatural behavior were hurled freely, often turning performance into scandal. In some cases, moral panic followed, and the law could step in with arrests and fines. Actors' very bodies became objects of public scrutiny, their movements and gestures a subject of rumor and speculation. Yet prejudice was not only a matter of fear or moralizing. It had practical consequences on the actors' lives. A troupe arriving in a new town often struggled to find lodgings, as innkeepers feared the disruption or retribution from local authorities. Villagers sometimes refused to pay for performances, seeing actors as tricksters or cheats, exploiting the gullible with their illusions. Begging for patronage, which was a common part of survival, could be met with stones or insults rather than coins. Every town carried a new negotiation with suspicion, every performance a delicate act of diplomacy. Actors could not rely on reputation alone. They needed charm, patience, and sometimes luck to navigate the hostility of the crowds. The prejudice also shaped the way actors behaved among themselves. Many developed thick skins, learning to laugh off insults or brush aside slights. Humor became a shield against a world that viewed them as outsiders. Yet beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Men and boys who lived day and night in the theater, risking health and dignity for the sake of a few shillings, were constantly reminded that the society they entertained and inspired held them in contempt. It was a paradox. Adored on the stage, shunned in the street, applauded for talent, condemned for existence. Superstition amplified the tension. Rumors of curses and ill fortune shadowed the theater like an invisible draft. Some villagers claimed that a troupe's arrival foretold misfortune, linking sickness, accidents, or failed crops to the player's presence. Mothers warned daughters not to sit too close to the stage, fearing influence over their hearts or minds. Children were taught that actors might steal something essential: a soul, a charm, a secret. Even if one did not believe, the persistence of these stories created a climate in which actors were perpetually regarded as untouchable, both admired and feared. Despite the prejudice, some actors learned to use it to their advantage. The aura of danger and exoticism surrounding the profession could attract curious audiences. The very reputation for cunning or immorality made townsfolk more eager to witness the spectacle, testing their courage or indulging in secret fascination. Troupes played on this tension, highlighting the forbiddance, the daring, the risk elements of their performances. Yet even when the stage offered fame or attention, the underlying prejudice remained, a constant pressure reminding actors that outside the theater walls, they were always on precarious ground. This public disdain extended to relationships with patrons and authorities. Nobility might protect a troupe, but ordinary townsfolk often resisted any intrusion of theatrical presence into their daily lives. Arguments broke out over space for performance, disputes over coin, and occasional mobs demanded that actors be driven away. These confrontations were not mere annoyances, they could be dangerous. A careless word, a mockery misinterpreted, or a sudden accident on stage could inflame the crowd. Actors had to negotiate every encounter carefully, balancing spectacle with safety, artistry with survival. Even within the theater, the echoes of prejudice followed them. Servants, apprentices, and other members of the household often regarded the actors with suspicion, wary of their influence, fearful of their presence. This meant that camaraderie among players was essential. Bonds formed in adversity, strengthened by the shared knowledge that the world outside saw them as outsiders, interlopers, or worse. Trust was a precious commodity, forged in rehearsal rooms and backstage corridors where the audience's gaze could not reach. Ultimately, public prejudice was more than social scorn. It was an invisible force, shaping every aspect of an actor's existence. From the meals they could afford, the lodgings they could rent, the towns where they could perform, to the strategies they used to navigate law and superstition, prejudice dictated the rhythm of their lives. It was a constant negotiation between art and survival, illusion and reality, applause and contempt. Yet in enduring this prejudice, actors became resilient. They learned to read crowds, to anticipate fear and suspicion, to adapt and survive. Their art flourished not despite these obstacles, but in dialogue with them. Every sneer from a groundling, every whispered warning from a fearful parent, became part of the texture of performance. It shaped the subtle gestures, the tone of voice, the careful modulation of expression that would eventually make Elizabethan theater legendary. In the end, the prejudice actors faced was inseparable from the power of the stage itself. It was the mirror the audience held up, reflecting fear, superstition, and social hierarchies, and actors were forced to navigate the jagged edges. They learned to survive through wit, discipline, and endurance, turning public contempt into a backdrop against which brilliance could shine. In a world that feared and mistrusted them, the actors carved out a space of creativity, resilience, and fleeting glory. A space where the audience for a few hours could forget judgment and be swept away by the magic they conjured. In the midst of the shadows, the squalor, and the endless whispers of suspicion, there existed moments that lifted Elizabethan actors out of the relentless grind of survival. These moments were rare, bright flashes of joy that burned through the cold and fear, leaving a warmth that no meager meal or hard bed could provide. It was the thrill of performance, the rush of stepping onto the boards and feeling the gaze of hundreds of eyes, the hum of anticipation vibrating in the air. For an actor, there was no sensation quite like it, no reward that could compare to the living connection between performer and audience. From the moment the curtain, or in many playhouses, the open boards rose, the world of the stage became a separate reality. It was a space where time slowed, where the struggles of the day, the gnawing hunger, the biting cold, and the public prejudice melted into the background. The actor's body became both instrument and vessel, every movement, inflection, and gesture charged with purpose. There was a particular electricity in those first steps onto the stage, a sense that the air itself was waiting to be shaped. that the very room would respond to voice, motion, and intent. The audience, in turn, fed the actors with its reactions. Gasps, laughter, sighs, applause all were like fuel to a fire that burned deep within. In those moments, actors felt an almost sacred sense of power, the ability to manipulate emotion, to create worlds, to summon tears or joy with mere words. Yet the joy was intertwined with fear. Every line, every gesture, every expression had to be precise. Mistakes could ruin the spell, draw ridicule, or invite scorn. The stakes were high, and yet this tension amplified the thrill. It demanded complete presence, a kind of concentration that left the mind both exhausted and exhilarated. And when it worked, when the words flew, the story unfolded, and the audience was swept along, the sensation was incomparable. The applause, whether raucous or restrained, served as both validation and exorcism, banishing doubt and fear for a brief, radiant interval. Actors learned to cherish even the smallest acknowledgments. A whispered compliment from a fellow player backstage, a nod from a noble patron in the gallery, the laughter of children in the pit, all these became treasured tokens in a life often marred by hardship. Survival in the theater depended on these sparks of joy, for they reminded performers why they endured the grime, the rats, the cold, and the constant threat of mob anger or legal persecution. Without the joy of performance, the stage would have been nothing more than a trap, a place to suffer and starve in silence. With it, the boards became a sanctuary, a space where even the most downtrodden could feel alive, powerful, and seen. The thrill was also communal. Actors thrived on the shared energy of the troupe. They moved, spoke, and breathed as one organism, responding to cues, improvising when needed, and covering for each other when missteps occurred. This sense of unity created a deep, almost familial bond, forged not in comfort, but in shared labor and risk. The joy of performance was multiplied by this camaraderie. The laughter behind the scenes, the whispered encouragements, and the collective exhilaration at a scene well executed made the grueling days worthwhile. An actor alone could achieve nothing. The magic relied on the ensemble, each member contributing skill, timing, and intuition. And then there was the magic of audience interaction. The Elizabethan theater was not a passive experience. The audience's reactions were immediate, their energy tangible. An actor could feel it in the pit, in the galleries, in every shuffling foot, cough, or gasp. The live response shaped the performance, and in turn, the performance shaped the audience. It was a dialogue without words, a shared heartbeat between stage and crowd. Moments when the audience laughed at a joke, gasped at a betrayal, or wept at a tragic turn created a kind of alchemy, turning timber boards, crude props, and a handful of costumes into an immersive world. These were the instances when actors truly understood the power of their craft, a power so strong it could momentarily erase the struggles of their daily lives. The rare moments of recognition extended beyond applause. Occasionally, a patron would single out a performer, offering coins, praise, or invitations to more prestigious venues. These gestures were not merely material, they were affirmations of worth, acknowledgement that the toil, the danger, and the social contempt had meaning. Even fleeting admiration left a lasting imprint, a reminder that, despite societal scorn, actors wielded influence, commanded attention, and could create beauty in a world often indifferent to them. It was a form of immortality, however temporary, that made the next day's hardships bearable. The joy was sometimes mischievous. Actors, understanding the power of laughter, could manipulate scenes, improvising lines to provoke unexpected reactions. The pit might erupt in uncontrolled mirth, while noble spectators could be embarrassed, delighted, or challenged in subtle ways. These small victories, ephemeral though they were, allowed actors to reclaim a measure of agency in a life otherwise governed by survival, public prejudice, and legal restrictions. The ability to influence, to conjure emotional reactions with nothing but words and presence, provided a heady, intoxicating sense of mastery, a counterpoint to the vulnerability of their station. Even the repetition of performance, often grueling and monotonous, carried its own rhythm of satisfaction. Mastery came slowly, and each successful execution brought a quiet pride. The memorization of dozens of lines, the coordination of complex movements, the precise timing of cues all required skill honed over years. When executed flawlessly, the result was a living tapestry of art and discipline. The joy of performance, therefore, was not only in the immediate applause, but also in the subtle satisfaction of craft perfected, a reward for years of painstaking effort, sleepless nights, and harsh conditions. Actors also learned to find joy in small improvisations, in moments when the story could be bent, shaped, or heightened for dramatic effect. The subtle raising of a hand, a glance that lingered too long, a pause at a critical moment, these tiny manipulations carried immense weight, affecting audience perception and emotional engagement. They were small acts of rebellion and artistry within a world that often sought to constrain them. Each successful maneuver reinforced the actor's sense of control over their immediate reality, a rare power in lives otherwise dictated by poverty, prejudice, and the whims of townsfolk or patrons. In the end, the joy of performance was inseparable from the hardships actors endured. It was a fragile, ephemeral pleasure, fleeting yet vital, a light in the darkness of their existence. It offered not only escape, but validation, a reminder that their labor, skill, and courage had purpose. For every night spent in cramped, rat-infested quarters, for every encounter with a hostile crowd, or a narrow escape from the law, the glow of applause and the thrill of transformation into character provided a counterweight, a sustaining force that made the dangers bearable and the sacrifices worthwhile. Even as the stage burned with the energy of audience engagement, the memory of that joy lingered long after the final curtain. It carried actors back through bitter winters, through crowded inns and dark alleyways, reminding them that they had a rare and precious gift, the ability to make the world believe, if only for a few hours, that magic was real, that emotion was alive, and that beauty could emerge from the chaos of their lives. In the face of hardship, prejudice, and endless uncertainty, the joy of performance became a lifeline, a reason to endure, to dream, and to return, night after night, to the boards that could make them both invisible and immortal. The wooden boards of Elizabethan playhouses, once worn smooth by the scuffed boots of countless performers, seem now to whisper stories of triumph and hardship, of lives lived at the edge of chaos and art. Though centuries have passed, the echoes of those cramped, smoky, and chaotic theaters resonate in every corner of modern drama. In every theater where actors step onto a stage, knowing that their craft carries both risk and magic. The legacy of Elizabethan actors is not merely in the words they delivered, the characters they inhabited, or the applause they earned. It lies in the courage, ingenuity, and resilience that allowed a fragile profession to flourish under circumstances that would have crushed most. Their struggles, performed night after night in the cold, the dark, and the stink of crowded playhouses, created a foundation upon which the very notion of theater, as both art and communal experience, could endure and evolve. In their time, actors faced a precarious existence. The threat of mobs, the unpredictability of noble patronage, and the constant scrutiny of civic authorities meant that every performance was a balancing act between survival and expression. They were expected to entertain, to educate, to provoke emotion, all while navigating social prejudice, financial instability, and the ever-present danger of physical harm. To stand on that stage was to confront not only the immediate challenges of performance, but the broader uncertainties of life itself. Yet out of these conditions arose artistry of extraordinary depth and subtlety. Actors learned to command attention, to manipulate audience emotion, and to infuse even the simplest gestures with meaning. The stage became a laboratory for human behavior, a place where courage and creativity intertwined in a dance that would influence centuries of theatrical tradition. The influence of Elizabethan actors can be traced not only in performance style, but also in the very structure of theater. The demands of crowded playhouses, with audiences surrounding the stage on multiple sides, required actors to develop techniques of projection, gesture, and movement that communicated to every corner of the room. The improvisational skills honed to survive unexpected interruptions, from rambunctious groundlings to collapsing scenery, became a training ground for adaptability and resilience. This environment encouraged innovation, stagecraft that maximized limited resources, narrative techniques that engaged diverse audiences, and collaborative practices that emphasized ensemble performance over individual stardom. These lessons reverberate in theaters today, where actors continue to navigate spatial challenges, audience expectations, and the dynamic unpredictability of live performance. Equally significant was the cultural imprint of these early performers. Through their craft, they bridged social divides, bringing stories of kings and commoners alike to audiences that spanned class and status. Their performances were more than entertainment. They were a form of social commentary, a lens through which contemporary issues, human emotion, and moral questions could be explored safely. By embodying characters who spoke, acted, and suffered, Elizabethan actors allowed audiences to confront ideas and feelings that might otherwise remain suppressed. This capacity to illuminate the human condition, to reflect society back upon itself through art, became a defining feature of theater as a cultural institution. Modern drama, from the intimate stages of small theaters to the grandeur of Broadway, owes a debt to this early practice of engaging audiences with narrative, emotion, and reflection. The legacy of their resilience is equally profound. Richard Burbage, Will Kemp, and countless lesser-known actors demonstrated that survival in a perilous profession required ingenuity, solidarity, and a deep understanding of human behavior. They navigated social prejudice, dangerous working conditions, and economic instability with a combination of skill, cunning, and endurance that allowed their craft to survive where many would have faltered. These actors showed that creativity thrives even in adversity, that art can flourish under pressure, and that a performance can be an act of both defiance and survival. Their lives illustrate a timeless truth. The dedication and courage of performers can shape culture far beyond their immediate circumstances, leaving a mark that echoes for generations. Moreover, the Elizabethan approach to performance, honed in these harsh conditions, laid the groundwork for acting theory and pedagogy. Observing how actors adapted to spatial limitations, engaged with audience reactions, and conveyed complex emotion with minimal props, provides a blueprint that continues to inform training programs today. The emphasis on physicality, vocal control, and improvisational skill, developed in response to environmental and social pressures, has been codified into methods taught in conservatories and theater schools around the world. In this way, the struggles of performers centuries ago became the foundation for structured knowledge, transforming survival strategies into enduring principles of dramatic craft. The stories of celebrated actors like Burbage and Kemp also serve as cautionary tales and sources of inspiration. Their triumphs illuminate the rewards of dedication and skill. Their hardships reveal the costs of fame, risk, and the tenuous nature of social favor. Future generations of actors learned, implicitly or explicitly, from both the successes and failures of these pioneers. In every modern stage production, echoes of their innovation, courage, and adaptability can be felt. Directors, actors, and playwrights draw upon this heritage, building upon techniques and strategies first developed to navigate the unforgiving realities of Elizabethan theaters. In this sense, the legacy of these actors is living, dynamic, and continuously evolving, bridging centuries of theatrical practice and human experience. The enduring influence of Elizabethan actors extends to the very perception of theater as a profession. They demonstrated that performance is not merely amusement, but a serious, disciplined art form capable of shaping culture, provoking thought, and sustaining community. By persevering through material deprivation, social marginalization, and the physical risks of their profession, they elevated the status of acting, laying the groundwork for its eventual recognition as a legitimate and respected vocation. The courage required to step onto the stage, to inhabit a character fully, and to engage an audience with authenticity resonates with performers today who continue to grapple with the pressures and rewards of bringing stories to life. Even as centuries pass and the physical playhouses crumble into history, the human drama enacted within them remains a touchstone. The Elizabethan stage was a crucible of creativity and endurance, where actors refined their craft through necessity, experimentation, and collaboration. The names of Burbage, Kemp, and their contemporaries endure not only because of personal fame, but because of the lasting impact their artistry had on theater itself. They forged a path through adversity, demonstrating that commitment, talent, and courage can transform even the harshest conditions into moments of beauty and wonder. Every modern performance that evokes laughter, fear, or awe carries forward the legacy of these pioneers, whose lives remind us that theater is an intimate dialogue between performer, audience, and society, constantly evolving yet deeply rooted in its origins. The lessons of Elizabethan actors extend beyond technique and craft. Their experiences underscore the importance of perseverance, adaptability, and community. They reveal how individuals can navigate complex social, economic, and environmental pressures while creating lasting art. Their story is one of courage, of embracing risk for the sake of expression, and of understanding the profound influence that performance can have on collective consciousness. In honoring their legacy, modern performers, audiences, and scholars recognize the continuity of human creativity, the enduring power of narrative, and the essential role of theater in exploring and reflecting the human experience. In remembering these actors, one sees not only their struggles, but also their triumphs, the ability to transform a wooden stage, candlelight, and the jeers of the crowd into enduring art. Their influence shaped storytelling, performance, and theatrical culture in ways that ripple into the present day. They created a bridge between the everyday and the extraordinary, showing that art can emerge even in the most challenging environments, that courage and innovation can turn adversity into brilliance, and that the human desire for narrative and expression is timeless. Elizabethan actors slept among rats, endured threats of mobs, and performed in relentless conditions. Yet through their dedication, skill, and creativity, they ensured that the stage would remain a sacred space for imagination, reflection, and communal experience. Their legacy is not confined to history books. It lives in every line delivered on stage, in every gasp of an audience, and in every story told with passion, precision, and courage.